Welcome to Green Connections, where we help you live green, work green, and earn green. I'm Joan Michelson. Find us online on greenconnectionsradio.com, like us on Facebook, and follow me on Twitter at Joan Michelson. You can also follow us at Green Connections on Twitter on Green Connects DC. Email us your questions and ideas at info@greenconnectionsradio.com. We love your questions and ideas. This week, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, I think it's abbreviated, came out with a scathing report on us humans, I'm afraid to say. We are destroying the planet, and we need to change our ways, and fast. Today we are joined in the studio by a talented NASA scientist who is at the epicenter of the government agency that is helping us measure exactly the impact we humans are having. And she's helping to develop recommendations for what we can do to mitigate our impact. Molly Brown, a Ph.D., is a research scientist at NASA's Biospheric Sciences branch, and her specialty is research on the impact of humans on the planet. Welcome to Green Connections, Dr. Brown.
Thank you.
Dr. Brown has been at NASA for 15 years. Interestingly, before she came to NASA, she was at the Peace Corps, in Africa. You were in Senegal, is that
correct?
Wow, good for you. And I have to tell you that in 2010, Dr. Brown was awarded the prestigious National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration David Johnson Award for her, quote, innovative and groundbreaking contributions to incorporating remote sensing into economic models to address agricultural production in developing countries. Wow. Speaking of agricultural production, my first question for you today is on the UN report on climate change risk. This report issues dire warnings, including for water and the food supply. So my question to you in starting off here is, what's your reading of this report that just came out from the UN?
Well, it's hard to overestimate the risk to people all around the world to climate change. The problem that we have is that the people who are least responsible for the problem are the ones who will feel the hurt most soonest, and they're the ones with the least amount of ability to adapt to the impact of climate on their livelihood.
Well, as I recall at the recent COP meeting, this was a big issue, that the developing nations who are at most risk were up in arms, saying, wait a minute, guys, we need your help, and we don't want foreign aid, but this is happening to us, and you're kind of ignoring us because we have no power.
Yes, and it's a real problem. You can't just go into a small village in Africa, and if you pour millions of dollars into that village, it won't become, Swaziland will not become Switzerland just because you spend money on it. There's cultural, political, historical, biological, ethnic, you name it, the reasons are very long about why you cannot just transform a society by putting money into it. The Africans themselves must choose their own path. They must do their own work. And what we need to do is to not only get out of the way, but stop undermining the climate system so they have an opportunity. So it's really a balance between changing our society to be less carbon central and developing our society so that we're less vulnerable to future climate change.
Well, in my view, I think that you can develop these developing nations and new cities, if you will, by learning from our mistakes. Exactly. And not doing it on the backs of coal and petroleum-based products, but build them as sustainable communities from the beginning. So address the issue of climate change and the food crisis.
So I do basic research on connecting weather shocks like droughts and floods and cold winters and super hot summers to the price of food in small local markets. And so trying to use satellite remote sensing as to better understand the likely change in food prices. And what we see from that work is that there are a lot of places that are extremely vulnerable to droughts. And so if you think about our farmer in Africa, if you have a big drought, that farmer's income drops by 50 or 80%. At the same time, his need for money to buy food goes up by 150%. And so, it just doesn't work out. But a lot of them just starve. The thing about the food crisis is that we have enough food in the world for everyone. What the problem is the distribution of that food.
So what can we do about the global food crisis exactly? How can we mitigate any climate change-induced weather patterns or drought, floods, tsunamis? You have all this data. You're doing all this great research. Where is it leading us in terms of solutions?
There's a lot that we can do. We can have better agricultural trade policies. We can stop.
Such as what? What are better agriculture and trade? Just give me an example.
An example of that is that we should be far more open to importing food from elsewhere, which might be more competitive than our own farmers.
So instead of this big push in supermarkets to buy American produce, we should not resist buying produce from Chile or someplace else.
Another big thing that we can do is to one big thing is to reduce debt. So a lot of these small African nations owe like 10 times their GDP in debts which were engendered back in 1975 and 1980. And we could just say, look, forget it. Debt forgiveness is an extremely effective way of improving the ability of these countries.
That's like filing bankruptcy in the U.S.
So another one is technology. So one of the big transformative thing that could happen is we could help them invest in their own technological development, help them work on increasing their yields in a very culturally specific way. Locally specific development is taking their own crops and increasing their productivity using genetic methods or using just simply...
Well, that brings me to an interesting question about GMOs, genetically modified foods, and pesticides. Since you're talking about increasing yield, let's talk about pesticides first. All pesticides are not created equal, in my view.
But I can tell you that in these very underdeveloped places, they don't use anything. They don't use hardly any fertilizer and no pesticides,
but they're only
no fungicides,
but they're getting very low productivity.
Exactly. What we want to do is support the communities there to train them and teach them about what is possible and then have them develop locally and culturally accepted methods and approaches which will help increase yields. You have to ask, what is your problem? What do you need? What are the problems you're struggling with? I mean, it is a two-way conversation, right? So that's, I think that Africa can really use our technology, but I don't believe that the U.S. companies are going to just fly in and save the day.
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm just looking for solution. So what are the top 3 things that business leaders and consumers, us humans, if you will, can do to create a more sustainable planet to reduce the risks of climate change?
Watch how many airplanes you take, because airplanes will multiply your carbon footprint by 10,000. So another one is to try not to eat meat. Beef and pork you have to feed a cow 10 times the amount of grain. Beef and pork are just, so incredibly inefficient carbon-wise.
Wow.
And the other thing is, if everyone on the planet stopped eating meat tomorrow, then we would have 10 times more food than we do now.
Well, that makes me feel even better that I stopped eating meat when I was 13. So there we go.
Yeah.
So I love this. This is really great. Well, you are an enormous model and inspiration, and thank you for what you do every day to mitigate climate risk and to feed people around the globe, including here, and frankly, to sell the message to the power brokers as well. You are truly an inspiration, and I'd like all of you to join me in thanking Dr. Molly Brown for doing what she does every day for the country. Thank you for joining us on Green Connections.
My pleasure.
Wow, Dr. Brown is so incredible. And if you were sitting here, she's full of energy. Here's what I heard Molly say, Dr. Brown say. The UN report, it's hard to overestimate the impact of climate change on human beings. That's pretty remarkable. And it's hard to deny at this point. And her focus is on the most vulnerable people on the planet. She made a really good point. The least responsible will be the most affected, and they have the least amount of resources to deal with it, and they have the least amount of control over it. She also said you just can't transform the society, that they have to choose their own path. Money alone is not the answer. It's about giving them the technology and the resources to develop it on their own, within their own cultural mores and their own cultural systems. And a key thing she said we could do is to help these more vulnerable communities that are being affected the most is to reduce the debt of these small countries, especially in Africa. And we can give them the technologies to help them increase the yields with their own local processes and methodologies and cultures, help them do it on their own, in their own way. The other thing that she said was, here's what we can do in our own world. We can reduce our beef and pork consumption, which was really fascinating for me to hear her say, because she said a lot of the food we produce actually goes to feeding them, when it could be exported to these more developing countries or to people in our own ecosystem who need it. So thanks again to Dr. Molly Brown of NASA for joining us, and thank you for joining us as well at Green Connections, where we help you live green, work green, and earn green. I'm Joan Michelson. Find us online on greenconnectionsradio.com, like us on Facebook, and follow me on Twitter at Joan Michelson, or follow Green Connections on Twitter at GreenConnectsDC. Email us your ideas and questions for Molly and our other guests, or about the UN report at info@greenconnectionsradio.com. And you can also post them for us on Facebook. Thank you so much for joining us. See you next time.
Capital Audio Post, your one-stop shop for your post-production needs. 703-712-8757.
Our services include video editing, sound design, sound mixing, ISDN recording, and many other media-related services.
Let us finish your project no matter where you are, across the U.S. or across the world. Go to www.capitalaudiopost.com. Call us at 703-712-8757.
Let us know how we can help you finish your production.